BGC 112 British Literature hariba section 2 dagi oidoni ko aduga early 20th century gi modernism hariba topic se ngasi dagi hui analysis toba horani ko aduna ngasi gi je BGC 112 British Literature early 20th century aduga block number 1 modernism unit number 1 modernism haidon moidoni ko haibadi ngasi gi jina hui gi background lecture gum haiba tare ko aduda modernism habse karino karidagi lakibano ko habadi as a response to have tare ko kari ages likna ko literature ki ages level maina modernism ji karba age to represent wi maje apoi gi time frame have tare ko kaya dagi na kya bo oi ko li have me am to ko yeng to ri bne ba aduga ko gi modernism matung da lakpa postmodernism ni matang su kita analysis sabuni aduga koi gi postmodernism have ma or metamodernism have ma si matang su kita hinagani ko tu nang si topic se BEGC 112 British Literature early 20th century aduga block number 1 ki modernism unit 1 modernism ni ko my background. So, aims and objectives in this unit, we will learn about developments in 20th century literature. 20th century literature is the atopa century singing na bakanda ko. Kari kenaba, kari ahong balai equally. I bet the literature je kugi tangkak oina kaido obani ko. Romanticism habalai, Victorian literature lay, realism ko, Victorian realism hierarchy ko. Oditi classical literature ko, Renaissance literature matanga lay dumaina. Modernism ma sagi space am lejem ko na akwai developments in 20th century literature to focus on aduga the genres of modernism ki genres makhan habo me apni ko magi kari category legi habato odagi what is modernism ji ko command define to bani modernism have se kari no have ni odagi the rise of modernism haragana modernism je kari dagi lakipno kari na maram moraga as a response to have tare ko kari ki against lakibano lepkibno have the nabi to aduga characteristics of forms modernism postmodernism and postmodernism metamodernism have ko on characteristics kari magun cheli haibate moje tonga na khaidok pagi maram je kari no kari de khene kari da mane ko aduga the continuation la aduga against the lepra adu me am do yeng do ri ko aduna in this unit when you learn to see developments in 20th century literature the genres of modernism what is modernism happens the rise of modernism aduga finally ngasigi lecture da kun na see characteristics of forms modernism postmodernism and postmodernism have zero ko ona akoina focus to topics kari yami ko abi ten tak ni yeng do ri bani ngasi this just introductory lecture ni ko yam kupna deeply analysis to giro just with understanding about the foundational knowledge ama leiba amadi taka ta bani na baltagi hawdo tori I think it's like classical. Introduction to Modernism. During this program of study, we have encountered writers from different periods of English literature and sampled distinctive styles and genres associated with their ages. Nasiki kuigi studies kuigi programs sida kari thignare habakanda period makan dagi English literature gi period makan dagi koi mayam thignare classical oiro Victorian oiro Elizabethan oiro makan thignare aduga and sample distinctive styles and genres associated with their ages ona moi ki tangkat tugi unique oiba qualities habitare unique oiba magun myang ma ko adu kui neinare ingnare ko beginning with Homer have say kui the Iliad and the Odyssey irame na mayam na thazana ba believe to habitare ko accept to blind poetry mana writing around 8000 BC that iba hubani then studied English literature from Elizabethan period haragadi kui Shakespeare hoigi ko moi matong ki ko we Christopher Marlowe hoigi lore through to the end of the Victorian age learned by the haragana kui novelist kum haragana Charles Dickens kum habi ko the Conrad Austin ko moi miyam se khara lobi ko na Conrad Webb de mo modernism ka daksana ko Dickens hoi Austin ne ayam lower sin ko aduna akhoi masigi program of studies sida akhoi writers makan thengnare belonging to different periods ko moi jo masa masa ki tak talei bani na moi ni ithorok gi mong moi na seasonable theme haiba tare technique haiba tare anything loina ma khenei ko amaga qualities yam khenaba myam ma akhoi phau ngami example in harbada romantic age kumba wiki Wordsworth hoi Coleridge hoi ko moigi matam ki writers in sor ko kana nature de yamna focus toba example in haini ko or the yamna subjective oiba science amasung logic pu reject to style ko uba pani or the Victorian age tana wiki Dickens hoi na or the Austen mani thor ko kana mo realism yam naksane habidi matam dugi society matam dugi tradition culture myam do yamna honestly amasung yamna realistically moigi work sing da portrait of the woman of the Madumyan of Harrisco. Or did the genre Sumakan later? Homer Day Horaga, beginning with Homer, writing around 800 BC, 800 BC, Daida, one Ibo, the Hagibidi, the Iliad, Amasung the Odyssey, epic ni, Greek epics ni, among the credit topony, Yamna Sang, the epic ni, Homer say blind joy, blind boy in Hanazu, and my name, Ona Magi works tagi horaga koi paba hore koi study tore ko the civil legal pare atuka then studied English literature from Elizabethan period like the hujta ha giba Shakespeare wiki ko Spencer hoi the Christopher Marlowe ko Ben Jonson moi matam ko Elizabethan age wiki golden age of English literature kind of high ni ko atu period jo pi ni nare through to the end of the Victorian age loibo on the Victorian age so ha giba ko Dickens wigumba Austen hoigumba ko ati Fielding hoigumba example na haru ko Victorian age mo realism mo madu ko ni nare ko mathangi slide tong laksi. These periods are broadly associated with movements such as classicism, romanticism, neoclassicism, and Victorian realism. Auna classical works in the Nakwina Kari Ubungam Ki Habakanto, common feature hierarchy, Quina order amasung harmony amakwina Yantareko, we systematic oiba itoropata yamna beginning, middle, and end ko wiki Greek keywords kumbakai kumbatumda example in Lopia Greek amasung Roman plays ko wiki Sophocles with iramba otidi topa Seneca ko example in harab ko topa matamdi writers in iramba works in se yamna systematic oi yamna order follow the week amasung harmonious oi ko wiki plot pora wiki story pora adum yam to ko winam sumne odagidi Elizabethan na ko Elizabethan drama amasung poetry ko example in harang Shakespearean gi ko moina yamna golden age ka hai ro ko to Elizabethan period ki do ko na English Renaissance na ju hai ko odagi romanticism haragana emotions masung imagination subjectivity sugumo me amdong focus tore moigi matam na mo ko kana na le kya bakanda Wordsworth hoi ko unji hagiba Coleridge hoi ko moi myam je odagi atopa ma haragana John Keats ba moi je ko romantic poets kana lo ni odi neoclassicism haragana ko ki Pope kumba yande ko Alexander Pope kumba writer sing je ko moi nong ira proje moi ju classical matok tamba new haragadi new habni ko na moi nong classical literature gi mo matok fazana follow to with ko moi ki Greek amasung Roman writers sing dramatists sing dagi when inspire or inspiration orga itoreo. The Victorian realism haragana morality ko Victorian standard kumba kai kumba ko the society ki standard social reform kumba da focus topa society se awang thak to thamba ko ki society ki benefit ta in a set society benefit ki da focus topa ma yam na ki Victorian realism ki factor mane or feature mane na harage. Writing from the early 20th century is grouped under modernism. Modernism is the exact scope ama piba natrasu ko. Akuina 1900s 1900 haibata ko. Haibati 20th century horopadagi 1930s 40s adaibo hainalawi ko. Ado yam matamda. Kari gino haibakanda kui 20th century lakta. Chakot pa Industrial Revolution ne mayam malakpa ko industrialization urbanization ꯃꯌꯥꯝ ꯑꯃ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯅ ꯎꯕ ꯐꯪꯉꯤ ꯆꯨꯝꯃꯤ ꯑꯗꯨꯕꯨ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯅ ꯀꯥꯎꯔꯣꯏꯗꯕꯗꯤ ꯃꯗꯨꯗꯒꯤ ꯍꯦꯟꯗꯣꯔꯛꯇꯨꯅ ꯅꯦꯒꯦꯇꯤꯚꯂꯤ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯇꯥꯔꯦꯀꯣ ꯂꯥꯟꯖꯥꯎ ꯑꯅꯤ ꯄ꯭ꯔꯤꯊꯤꯕꯤꯒꯤ ꯂꯥꯟꯖꯥꯎ ꯑꯆꯧꯕ ꯑꯅꯤ ꯑꯃ ꯊꯦꯡꯅꯩꯌꯦꯕꯀꯣ ꯐꯥꯔꯁ ꯋꯥꯔꯜ ꯋꯥꯔ 1914ꯗꯒꯤꯅ 1918 ꯐꯥꯎ ꯑꯃ ꯁꯦꯀꯦꯟ ꯋꯥꯔꯜ ꯋꯥꯔ 1939ꯗꯒꯤꯅ 1945 ꯐꯥꯎ ꯑꯃ ꯑꯗꯨꯅ ꯃꯁꯤꯒꯤ ꯋꯥꯔꯜ ꯋꯥꯔ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯁꯤꯅ ꯑꯅꯤꯁꯤꯅ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯒꯦꯀꯣ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯔꯥꯏꯇꯔꯁꯤꯡ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯣꯏꯒꯦ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯄꯤꯄꯜ ꯀꯣ ꯃꯤ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯗ ꯁꯦꯟꯁ ꯑꯣꯐ ꯐꯤꯌꯔ ꯑꯀꯤꯕ ꯇꯨꯖꯨꯡꯕ ꯏꯁꯥꯗ ꯄꯥꯈꯠꯍꯟꯕ ꯃꯌꯥꯝ ꯐꯥꯎꯍꯟꯈꯤꯕ ꯑꯗꯨꯗꯒꯤꯗꯤ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯁꯤꯁꯇꯦꯃꯦꯇꯤꯛ ꯑꯣꯏꯕ ꯁꯣꯁꯥꯏꯇꯤ ꯑꯃ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯝꯕꯗꯒꯤ ꯀꯣ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯐ꯭ꯔꯦꯒꯃꯦꯟꯇꯦꯠ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯛꯄ ꯑꯗꯨꯗꯩꯗꯤ ꯏꯁꯣꯔ ꯊꯥꯖꯔꯝꯕꯗꯒꯤ ꯀꯔꯤꯒꯤꯗꯃꯛꯇ ꯏꯁꯣꯔꯅꯕꯨ ꯑꯁꯨꯛ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯁꯐꯔꯤꯡ ꯀꯣ ꯑꯋꯥꯕ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯁꯦ ꯀꯔꯤꯒꯤ ꯐꯪꯍꯟꯗꯣꯏꯅꯣ ꯑꯁꯨꯛ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯊꯦꯡꯅꯍꯜꯂꯤꯁꯤ ꯀꯔꯤꯒꯤꯅꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯒ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯃꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯑꯒꯦꯟꯁꯇ ꯂꯥꯛꯄ ꯅꯠꯇꯦꯀꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯁ꯭ꯄꯤꯔꯤꯆꯨꯋꯦꯜ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯝꯕꯗꯒꯤ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯒꯦ ꯑꯦꯒꯅꯣꯁꯇꯤꯛ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯛꯄ ꯈꯣꯠꯂꯛꯄ ꯁꯤ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯁꯤꯁꯨ ꯐꯤꯆꯔ ꯑꯃꯅꯤꯀꯣ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯅꯤꯖꯝꯒꯤꯀꯣ ꯑꯗꯨꯒ ꯑꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯃꯇꯨꯡꯗ ꯂꯥꯛꯄ ꯋꯥꯏꯜ ꯂꯤꯇꯔꯦꯆꯔ ꯑꯥꯐꯇꯔ World War II up to the 1990s is termed post-modernism. Post ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯒꯗꯤ after ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯅꯤꯀꯣ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯟ ꯃꯇꯨꯡꯗ ꯂꯥꯛꯄ ꯁꯤꯗꯅ ꯑꯃꯨꯛ fragmented storytelling ꯂꯥꯛꯄ ꯑꯗꯨꯗꯒꯤꯗꯤ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ symbolic ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯛꯄ ꯀꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ modernism ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯒꯅ ꯍꯥꯟꯅ ꯂꯩꯔꯝꯕ ꯁ꯭ꯇꯥꯏꯜꯗꯨꯗꯒꯤ make it new ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯣ ꯑꯦꯖ꯭ꯔꯥ ꯄꯥꯎꯟꯒꯤ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯐꯖꯕ ꯀꯣꯠ ꯑꯃ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯒꯗꯤ ꯀꯔꯤꯅꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯀꯥꯟꯗ ꯃꯥꯅ make it new ꯍꯥꯏꯅ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯝꯃꯦꯕꯀꯣ ꯑꯗꯨ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯅꯤꯖꯝꯒꯤ ꯈꯣꯂꯥꯎꯅꯤ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯒꯦ ꯁ꯭ꯂꯣꯒꯟ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯒꯦꯀꯣ ꯑꯗꯨꯝ ꯄꯣꯁ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯅꯤꯖꯝꯅ ꯑꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯑꯒꯦꯟꯁ ꯑꯃꯨꯛ ꯂꯥꯛꯇꯣꯏꯅꯤ ꯀꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ ꯁꯦꯟꯇꯔ ꯑꯃ ꯂꯩꯇ꯭ꯔꯦ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯒꯤ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯅꯤꯖꯝꯅ ꯄꯦꯟꯗꯕ ꯅꯨꯡꯉꯥꯏꯇꯕ ꯐꯥꯎꯕ ꯄꯣꯁ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯅꯤꯖꯝꯅ ꯁꯦꯟꯇꯔ ꯑꯃ ꯂꯩꯇ꯭ꯔꯦ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯒꯤ ꯂꯤꯕꯔꯦꯁꯟ ꯐꯥꯎꯕ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏ ꯏꯁꯣꯔꯗ ꯊꯥꯖꯔꯝꯕ ꯈꯣꯠꯂꯝꯕ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯁꯦꯀꯣ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯕꯤꯌꯤꯡ ꯑꯝꯗ ꯊꯥꯖꯔꯝꯕ ꯈꯣꯠꯂꯝꯕꯁꯦ ꯊꯥꯖꯔꯛꯇꯕꯗ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯅꯤꯖꯝꯒꯤꯅ ꯃꯗꯨꯗ ꯅꯨꯡꯉꯥꯏꯇꯕ ꯐꯥꯎꯏ ꯄꯣꯁ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯅꯤꯖꯝꯒꯤꯅ ꯊꯥꯖꯗ꯭ꯔꯕꯅꯤꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏ ꯂꯤꯕꯔꯦꯇꯦꯠ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯦ ꯐ꯭रीडम ꯐꯪꯉꯦꯅ ꯈꯜꯂꯦꯕ ꯑꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯋꯥꯗ ꯈꯦꯠꯅꯕꯁꯦ ꯁꯤꯗ ꯅꯠꯇꯦꯀꯣ ꯃꯇꯪ ꯃꯇꯪ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯛꯀꯅꯤ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯅ ꯑꯦꯅꯥꯂꯥꯏꯁꯤꯁ ꯇꯧꯕ ꯀꯥꯟꯗ ꯑꯗꯨꯅ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯅꯤꯖꯝꯁꯦ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ 1900s ꯑꯗꯥꯏꯗꯒꯤ 1930s ꯈꯔꯅ 1930s 40s ꯑꯗꯥꯏꯕꯨ ꯍꯥꯏꯀꯣ ꯃꯗꯨꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯅꯤꯖꯝꯒꯤ ꯄꯤꯔꯤꯌꯠꯅꯤ ꯍꯥꯏ ꯐꯦꯃꯁ ꯔꯥꯏꯇꯔꯁ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯇꯥꯔꯦꯀꯣ ꯃꯇꯝꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯑꯐꯥꯎꯕ ꯔꯥꯏꯇꯔꯁ ꯈꯔ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯒꯗꯤ ꯖꯦꯝꯁ ꯖꯣꯏꯁ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯌꯥꯏ ꯚꯔꯖꯤꯅꯤꯌꯥ ꯋꯨꯜꯐ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯌꯥꯏ W.B. Yeats ꯀꯣ T.S. Eliot ꯃꯣꯏ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯁꯦ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯅ ꯍꯧꯖꯤꯛ ꯑꯦꯖ꯭ꯔꯥ ꯄꯥꯎꯟ ꯀꯧꯖꯩ ꯃꯃꯤꯡ ꯄꯜꯂꯝꯕ ꯃꯣꯏ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯁꯤꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯟ ꯔꯥꯏꯇꯔꯁꯤꯡꯒꯤ ꯀꯣ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯅꯤꯖꯝꯒꯤ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯀꯩ ꯍꯥꯏꯇꯥꯔꯦ epitome of modernism ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯇꯥꯔꯦꯀꯣ modernist writings or modernist writersꯤꯡꯒꯤ ꯃꯣꯏꯅ ꯈ꯭ꯋꯥꯏꯗꯒꯤ ꯆꯥꯎꯕ ꯏꯃꯦꯖꯅꯦꯕ ꯄꯣꯁ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯅꯤꯖꯝꯗꯨꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯃꯈꯜ ꯃꯈꯜ ꯂꯥꯛꯑꯦ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯀꯩꯅꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯌꯥꯏ ꯁꯦꯃꯨꯑꯦꯜ ꯕꯦꯀꯦꯠꯀꯨꯝꯕ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯌꯥꯏꯀꯣ ꯃꯥꯒꯤ ꯋꯦꯇꯤꯡ ꯐꯣꯔ ꯒꯣꯗꯣꯠ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯁꯦ ꯄꯣꯁ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯟ ꯀꯔꯤ ꯍꯥꯏꯇꯥꯔꯦ ꯋꯥꯔꯛ ꯑꯃꯒꯤ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯑꯣꯅꯦꯁ ꯑꯣꯏꯕ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯀꯩ ꯍꯥꯏꯇꯥꯔꯦ ꯄꯔꯐꯦꯛ ꯑꯣꯏꯕ ꯑꯦꯛꯖꯥꯝꯄꯜ ꯑꯃꯅ ꯂꯧꯒꯅꯤꯕ ꯑꯗꯨꯗꯒꯤꯗꯤ ꯗ ꯂꯤꯇꯔꯦꯆꯔ ꯑꯣꯐ ꯗ ꯂꯥꯁ 3 decades ꯀꯣ ꯂꯥꯁ 3 decades 1990s ꯀꯣ ꯃꯇꯥꯡꯗꯣ 80s 90s ꯀꯗꯥꯏꯗ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯛꯄꯗꯣ ꯀꯣ is often described as post-modernism or meta-modernism ꯑꯗꯨꯒ post-modernismꯒꯤ ꯃꯇꯨꯡꯗꯁꯨ ꯑꯃꯨꯛ ꯂꯥꯛꯏꯕꯀꯣ ꯅꯪꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ post-modernism ꯍꯥꯏ ꯅꯠꯇ꯭ꯔꯒ meta-modernism ꯍꯥꯏ making the past 100 years particularly distinctive in literary history ꯑꯗꯨꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯍꯧꯈ꯭ꯔꯕ ꯆꯍꯤ ꯆꯥꯝꯃꯃꯨꯛꯁꯦꯀꯣ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯗꯤꯁꯇꯤꯡꯇꯤꯞ ꯑꯣꯏ ꯇꯥꯡꯀꯛ ꯌꯥꯝ ꯐꯖꯅ ꯈꯥꯏ ꯃꯔꯝꯗꯨꯁꯨ ꯀꯣ ꯃꯣꯏ ꯈꯦꯠꯅꯕꯒꯤ ꯊꯤꯝꯁꯀꯤ ꯃꯇꯥꯡꯗ ꯁꯕꯖꯦꯛ ꯃꯦꯇꯔꯒꯤ ꯃꯇꯥꯡꯗ ꯀꯣ ꯃꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯕꯤꯂꯤꯐ ꯁꯤꯁꯇꯦꯝꯒꯤ ꯃꯇꯥꯡꯗꯁꯨ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯈꯥꯏꯗꯣꯛꯄꯗꯣ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯅ ꯏꯔꯥꯏ ꯂꯥꯏꯅ ꯎꯕ ꯐꯪꯉꯦꯕꯀꯣ ꯃꯁꯤꯗꯤ ꯍꯥꯏꯅꯤꯡꯉꯤꯁꯦ ꯃꯊꯪꯒꯤ ꯁ꯭ꯂꯥꯏꯗ ꯑꯃꯨꯛ ꯂꯥꯛꯁꯤ What is modernism? Modernism, derived from the idea of modern as opposed to the past, marked a decisive break from traditional forms and values in literature and the art. And modernism lakpa haibase kaishu natte hana leramba hana satnaramba mawong haiba tareko forms amasung values dagi tongan tarakpa adagi tokhorakpa natraga madagi nanthorakpa hairage ko aduna literature da juni aduga literature da natte ko koigi artwork kumbado obi ai painting gumba kai gumba ko art kumbada odagi architecture da music da film da any form of expression have that any form of artistic expression have the scenery ge ba aduna hana lerba mong hana sadaramba formula have tare adagi nanthuraga adagi separate toraga anova mong ama introduce or kujiku okina modernism gi magun namani ka. In the early 20th century, it represented an experimental search for new modes of expression across literature, visual arts, architecture, music, dance, and drama. Aduna, sida hairagana early 20th century da modernism na experimental oiba hana tawnaramdaba completely new oiba ko ano oiba search ko for new modes of expression je na kamai ko literature da ko haibedi isa isa gi expression je hana lerami ba chatnaram ba phai pajade whatever established toraba rules myam du thugairaga established over rules myam du avoid toraga natraga nan thairaga haibetare ko ano ba expression ni mo thorakpa literature da boero visual arts da boero architecture da boero music da boero dance or drama da boero sibo kuina modernism gi kuiki experimental search to bu when define the way. Although modernism is most clearly associated with the years after World War One, its roots can be traced to the end of the Victorian age around 1900. Anna modernism chapi First World War matungda. First World War gi effect ni, First World War gi byproduct ni haina mayamna critics mayamna lawragasu ikoina modernism gi wave se have tare. Ko magi roots magi maraj se katai dagi akoin uba phangi have kanda Victorian age lorakpa daita 1900s daita gi to kuin uba phangi ba. Auna modernism se even though akoina second First World War dagi haurakpa dagi First World War ki byproduct ni lawragasu ko magi irakpaki style irakpaki mong mayamjidi akoina 1900s adaida Victorian age dagidi modern age haibdo yawre or modern age haibdo madui to haure na lawe ko pina ko modernism na akwigi tradition reject to traditional oiba mong je reject to ba anova forms the experimental haibdi season na ba haibda ni ko awdagi ꯍꯥꯟꯅꯒꯤꯗꯨꯗꯒꯤ ꯆꯠꯅꯔꯝꯕ ꯕꯤꯂꯤꯐ ꯁꯤꯁꯇꯦꯝꯒꯨꯝꯕ ꯀꯩꯒꯨꯝꯕꯗꯨꯕꯨ ꯀꯣꯏꯁꯟ ꯍꯪꯕ ꯋꯥꯍꯪ ꯍꯪꯕ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯇꯥꯔꯦ ꯃꯗꯨ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯗꯨꯅꯦꯕ ꯐꯤꯆꯔꯁ ꯈꯔ ꯍꯥꯏꯌꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯒꯗꯤ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯅꯤꯖꯝꯒꯤꯁꯦ ꯃꯥꯒꯤ ꯀꯣꯔ ꯐꯤꯆꯔꯁ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯒꯗꯤꯀꯣ ꯈ꯭ꯋꯥꯏꯗꯒꯤ ꯃꯔꯨꯑꯣꯏꯕ ꯐꯤꯆꯔꯁ ꯈꯔ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯒꯗꯤ ꯃꯥ ꯍꯥꯟꯅ ꯂꯩꯔꯝꯕ ꯃꯑꯣꯡꯗꯣ ꯆꯦꯂꯦꯟꯖ ꯇꯧꯕ ꯑꯅꯧꯕ ꯑꯥꯏꯗꯤꯌꯥ ꯄꯨꯊꯣꯛꯄ ꯑꯅꯧꯕ ꯃꯑꯣꯡꯒꯤ ꯑꯦꯛꯁꯄꯦꯔꯤꯃꯦꯟ ꯇꯧꯕ ꯃꯗꯨ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯁꯦ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯅ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯅꯤꯖꯝꯒꯤ ꯁꯦꯂꯤꯌꯟ ꯐꯤꯆꯔꯁꯀ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯣꯀꯣ ꯑꯣꯔ ꯀꯣꯔ ꯐꯤꯆꯔꯁ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯒꯗꯤ ꯃꯗꯨ ꯍꯥꯏꯒꯅꯤ. Matanggi slide langsiko. The late Victorian period witnessed rapid industrialization, scientific advancement, urbanization, and major social change. On the late Victorian period, Guram Daita Habaniko, a quickie 20th century Yorum Daita. Kari Kari Hombalaki Habukanda, urbanization of Sanglai, Kari the Gilam, no Habakanda, Matam to the Wiki England's colonial power among the Chang Lerambadina. Moina, Moigi colonies, India Gumba colony, the key, wealth, Kuba, everything Kanaba Habitarako Miamze Moina, Low Kraga, Haragan, Moigi own country to the Poraga, Semgutpa, Sokotpa, industrialization Gumayam Toba, factories Gumayam Saba, Duga, raw materials singer, Moigi colony, de Lobranico, Africa, the labor colony, Asia, the labor colony, Sindigi Lorani, Duga, Moina, raw materials in the Puraga. ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯃꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯏꯟꯗꯁꯇ꯭ꯔꯤꯁ ꯑꯆꯧ ꯑꯆꯧꯕꯁꯤꯡꯗ ꯐꯦꯛꯇꯔꯤꯁ ꯑꯆꯧꯕꯁꯤꯡꯗ ꯄ꯭ꯔꯣꯁꯦꯁ ꯇꯧꯔꯒ ꯐꯤꯅꯤꯁ ꯒꯨꯗꯁꯇꯣ ꯑꯃꯨꯛ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯀꯣꯂꯣꯅꯤꯁꯤꯡꯗ ꯌꯣꯟꯖꯜꯂꯛꯇꯣꯏꯅꯦꯕꯀꯣ ꯑꯗꯨꯅ ꯇ꯭ꯔꯦꯗꯀꯨꯝꯕ ꯀꯩꯒꯨꯝꯕꯒꯤ ꯐꯦꯛꯇꯔ ꯑꯆꯧꯕ ꯑꯃꯅꯤ ꯑꯗꯨꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯚꯤꯛꯇꯣꯔꯤꯌꯟ ꯄꯤꯔꯤꯌꯗ ꯂꯣꯏꯔꯝꯗꯥꯏꯗ ꯔꯦꯄꯤꯗ ꯏꯟꯗꯁꯇ꯭ꯔꯤꯌꯦꯂꯥꯏꯖꯦꯁꯟ ꯃꯌꯥꯝ ꯑꯃ ꯎꯏ ꯑꯗꯨꯒ ꯁꯥꯏꯟꯇꯤꯐꯤꯛ ꯑꯦꯗꯚꯥꯟꯁꯃꯦꯟꯁꯨ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯎꯏꯌꯦꯕ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ ꯍꯥꯟꯅ ꯂꯩꯔꯝꯕ ꯁꯨꯄꯔꯁꯇꯤꯁꯤꯌꯁ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯝꯕ ꯀꯣ ꯐꯦꯠꯀꯨꯝꯕꯗ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯐꯣꯀꯁ ꯇꯧꯔꯝꯕꯗꯣ ꯁꯥꯏꯟꯁ ꯑꯣꯏꯅ ꯐꯣꯀꯁ ꯇꯧꯔꯦ ꯑꯦꯛꯖꯥꯝꯄꯜ ꯑꯣꯏꯅ ꯍꯥꯏꯒꯦ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯆꯥꯔꯜꯁ ꯗꯥꯔꯋꯤꯟ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯤꯁꯤꯅꯀꯣ ꯃꯥꯒꯤ ꯊꯤꯑꯣꯔꯤ ꯏꯚꯣꯂꯨꯁꯟꯒꯤ ꯊꯤꯑꯣꯔꯤꯒꯨꯝꯕ ꯀꯩꯒꯨꯝꯕꯗꯣ ꯃꯌꯥꯝ ꯑꯃ ꯊꯣꯛꯂꯛꯄꯗꯣꯀꯣ ꯃꯗꯨ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯗꯨꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯔꯤꯂꯤꯖꯟꯗ ꯑꯃꯁꯨꯡ ꯒꯣꯗꯇ ꯕ꯭ꯂꯥꯏꯟ ꯐꯦꯠ ꯊꯝꯃꯝꯕ ꯕ꯭ꯂꯥꯏꯟ ꯇ꯭ꯔꯁ ꯊꯝꯃꯝꯕꯗꯨꯗꯒꯤ ꯅꯥꯊꯩꯔꯛꯑꯒ ꯁꯥꯏꯟꯁꯇ ꯑꯣꯏꯅ ꯐꯣꯀꯁ ꯇꯧꯔꯛꯄ ꯁꯥꯏꯟꯁꯇ ꯑꯣꯏꯅ ꯄ꯭ꯔꯥꯏꯌꯣꯔꯤꯇꯤ ꯄꯤꯔꯛꯄꯁꯦ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯅ ꯏꯔꯥꯏ ꯂꯥꯏꯅ ꯎꯕ ꯉꯝꯃꯤ ꯑꯔꯕꯅꯥꯏꯖꯦꯁꯟ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯁꯤꯗꯤ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯏꯟꯗꯁꯇ꯭ꯔꯤꯌꯦꯂꯥꯏꯖꯦꯁꯟꯒꯨꯝꯕ ꯇꯧꯔꯛꯑꯕꯅꯤꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯇꯥꯎꯟꯗꯒꯤ ꯁꯤꯇꯤ ꯀꯣ ꯁꯤꯇꯤꯗꯒꯤ ꯃꯦꯇ꯭ꯔꯣꯄꯣꯂꯤꯁ ꯀꯥꯏ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯣꯀꯣ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯛꯄꯒꯤ ꯃꯑꯣꯡꯅꯤ ꯑꯗꯨꯅ ꯁꯤꯇꯤꯗ ꯂꯥꯛꯑꯒ ꯚꯤꯂꯦꯖꯔꯁ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯍꯨꯞꯇꯅ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯇꯥꯔꯦꯀꯣ ꯏꯟ ꯂꯥꯔꯖ ꯅꯝꯕꯔꯁ ꯃꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯚꯤꯂꯦꯖꯇ ꯂꯩꯔꯒꯗꯤ ꯃꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯑꯦꯗꯚꯥꯟꯁꯃꯦꯟꯕꯨ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯣ ꯏꯗꯨꯀꯦꯁꯟꯒꯤ ꯃꯇꯥꯡꯗ ꯃꯣꯏ ꯃꯆꯥ ꯃꯁꯨꯒꯤ ꯃꯇꯥꯡꯗ ꯑꯦꯗꯚꯥꯟꯁꯃꯦꯟꯗꯣ ꯐꯪꯉꯔꯣꯏ ꯍꯥꯏꯅ ꯃꯣꯏꯅ ꯁꯤꯇꯤꯗ ꯂꯥꯛꯑꯒ ꯁꯤꯇꯤꯗ ꯊꯨꯡꯉꯒ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯇꯥꯔꯦꯀꯣ ꯂꯩꯁꯜꯂꯛꯄ ꯑꯗꯩ ꯇꯥꯎꯟꯁꯤꯡꯁꯦ ꯃꯆꯥ ꯃꯆꯥ ꯇꯥꯎꯟꯁ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯁꯦ ꯐꯦꯛꯇꯔꯤ ꯁꯥꯖꯜꯂꯛꯄ ꯑꯃ ꯇꯧꯔꯛꯄꯗꯒꯤꯗꯤ ꯑꯔꯕꯟ ꯑꯦꯔꯤꯌꯥꯁ ꯑꯣꯏꯁꯤꯜꯂꯛꯄ ꯃꯁꯤ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯁꯦ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯅ ꯎꯕ ꯐꯪꯉꯦꯕ ꯑꯦꯟ ꯃꯦꯖꯔ ꯁꯣꯁꯤꯌꯦꯜ ꯆꯦꯟꯖ ꯁꯣꯁꯥꯏꯇꯤꯗꯁꯨ ꯆꯦꯟꯖ ꯃꯌꯥꯝ ꯎꯏ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯃꯤꯗꯜ ꯀ꯭ꯂꯥꯁꯀꯤ ꯃꯁꯤꯡ ꯍꯦꯟꯒꯠꯂꯛꯄꯀꯣ ꯍꯥꯟꯅꯗꯤ ꯑꯞꯄꯔ ꯀ꯭ꯂꯥꯁ ꯂꯣꯋꯔ ꯀ꯭ꯂꯥꯁ ꯍꯥꯏꯅ ꯂꯩꯔꯝꯕ ꯍꯥꯏꯇꯥꯔꯦꯀꯣ ꯑꯞꯄꯔ ꯀ꯭ꯂꯥꯁ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯒꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯀ꯭ꯂꯔꯖꯤꯒꯤ ꯄꯥꯔꯠꯁꯨ ꯑꯣꯏꯕ ꯌꯥꯏ ꯑꯣꯔ ꯅꯣꯕꯤꯂꯤꯇꯤꯗꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯤꯁꯤꯅꯦꯀꯣ ꯑꯦꯔꯤꯁꯇꯣꯀ꯭ꯔꯦꯁꯤꯒ ꯃꯔꯤ ꯂꯩꯅꯕ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯂꯥꯏꯔꯤꯛ ꯍꯩꯕ ꯄꯩꯁꯥ ꯄꯥꯏꯕ ꯏꯗꯨꯀꯦꯁꯟ ꯑꯦꯐꯣꯔꯠ ꯇꯧꯅꯕ ꯀꯥꯡꯕꯨꯗꯨꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏ ꯑꯞꯄꯔ ꯀ꯭ꯂꯥꯁ ꯂꯩ ꯑꯗꯨꯗꯩꯗꯤ ꯑꯗꯨꯒꯨꯝꯕ ꯉꯝꯖꯗꯕ ꯍꯦꯟ ꯇꯨ ꯃꯥꯎꯠꯇ ꯆꯥꯖꯕ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯂꯥꯏꯔꯕ ꯀꯣ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯐꯥꯔꯝꯗꯒ ꯊꯕꯛ ꯇꯧꯕ ꯃꯌꯥꯝ ꯐꯤꯜꯗꯒ ꯊꯕꯛ ꯇꯧꯕꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯂꯣꯋꯔ ꯀ꯭ꯂꯥꯁ ꯀꯣ ꯃꯗꯨ ꯑꯅꯤ ꯅꯠꯇꯕꯤꯗ ꯃꯔꯛꯇ ꯏꯗꯨꯀꯦꯁꯟ ꯂꯥꯏꯔꯤꯛꯀꯤ ꯃꯩꯉꯥꯟ ꯐꯪꯉꯕ ꯂꯥꯏꯔꯤꯛ ꯍꯩꯔꯕꯁꯤꯡ ꯀꯣ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯃꯤꯗꯜ ꯀ꯭ꯂꯥꯁ ꯍꯥꯏꯅ ꯑꯃꯨꯛ ꯊꯣꯛꯂꯛꯇꯣꯔꯦꯕꯀꯣ ꯃꯣꯏꯁꯦ ꯁꯤꯗ ꯀꯔꯤ ꯀꯔꯤ ꯌꯥꯎꯒꯦ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯀꯥꯟꯗ ꯇ꯭ꯔꯦꯗꯁꯃꯦꯟ ꯌꯥꯎꯔꯛꯑꯦ ꯇꯤꯆꯔꯁ ꯀꯣ ꯗꯣꯛꯇꯔꯁ ꯑꯗꯨꯒꯨꯝꯕ ꯃꯁꯥ ꯃꯁꯥꯒꯤ ꯅꯣꯂꯦꯖꯁꯨ ꯁꯤꯖꯤꯟꯅꯔꯒ ꯄꯩꯁꯥ ꯇꯥꯟꯖꯕ ꯀꯥꯡꯕꯨꯗꯀꯣ ꯃꯁꯤꯅ ꯃꯦꯖꯔ ꯁꯣꯁꯤꯌꯦꯜ ꯆꯦꯟꯖ ꯑꯃ ꯂꯥꯛꯄꯁꯨ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯅ ꯎꯕ ꯐꯪꯉꯦꯕ ꯅ꯭ꯌꯨ ꯗꯦꯕꯂꯞꯃꯦꯟꯠꯁ ꯏꯟ ꯁꯥꯏꯀꯣꯂꯣꯖꯤꯒꯤ ꯃꯇꯥꯡꯗ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯐ꯭ꯔꯣꯏꯗ ꯍꯣꯏꯒꯨꯝꯕꯀꯣ ꯁꯤꯒꯃꯟ ꯐ꯭ꯔꯣꯏꯗ ꯍꯣꯏ ꯀꯥꯔꯜ ꯌꯨꯡ ꯍꯣꯏ ꯃꯣꯏꯅ ꯄꯨꯔꯛꯄ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯁꯕꯀꯣꯟꯁꯤꯌꯁ ꯃꯥꯏꯟꯒꯤ ꯃꯇꯥꯡꯗ ꯐꯤꯂꯣꯁꯣꯐꯤꯒꯤ ꯃꯇꯥꯡꯗ ꯑꯃꯁꯨꯡ ꯄꯣꯂꯤꯇꯤꯀꯦꯜ ꯊꯣꯠ especially Freud's theories of the human mind challenge established beliefs and demanded new artistic forms ꯑꯗꯨꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯚꯤꯛꯇꯣꯔꯤꯌꯟ ꯄꯤꯔꯤꯌꯠ ꯂꯣꯏꯔꯝꯗꯥꯏ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯇꯥꯔꯦꯅꯦꯀꯣ 1900 ꯑꯗꯨꯋꯥꯏꯗꯗꯤ ꯁꯥꯏꯀꯣꯂꯣꯖꯤꯗ ꯐꯤꯂꯣꯁꯣꯐꯤꯗ ꯄꯣꯂꯤꯇꯤꯛꯁꯇ ꯑꯅꯧ ꯑꯅꯧꯕ ꯃꯈꯜ ꯃꯈꯜ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯒꯤ ꯊꯣꯠ ꯃꯌꯥꯝ ꯑꯃ ꯄꯨꯊꯣꯛꯅꯔꯛꯄ ꯍꯧꯔꯦ ꯑꯗꯨ ꯍꯧꯔꯛꯄꯅꯤꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏ ꯍꯥꯟꯅ ꯂꯩꯔꯝꯕ ꯑꯦꯁꯇꯥꯕ꯭ꯂꯤꯁ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯕ ꯆꯍꯤ ꯍꯟꯗ꯭ꯔꯦꯠꯁ ꯑꯦꯟ ꯍꯟꯗ꯭ꯔꯦꯠꯁ ꯑꯣꯐ ꯌꯔꯁꯇ ꯆꯨꯝꯃꯦ ꯍꯥꯏꯅ ꯂꯧꯔ ꯂꯥꯛꯑꯕ ꯕꯤꯂꯤꯐ ꯃꯌꯥꯝ ꯀꯣ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯗꯣ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏ ꯆꯦꯂꯦꯟꯖ ꯇꯧꯔꯛꯑꯒ ꯃꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯃꯥꯌꯣꯛꯇ ꯂꯩꯔꯛꯄ ꯍꯧꯔꯛꯑꯦ ꯑꯗꯨꯒ ꯑꯅꯧ ꯑꯅꯧꯕ ꯑꯥꯔꯇꯤꯁꯇꯤꯛ ꯐꯣꯔꯝꯁ ꯃꯌꯥꯝ ꯑꯃ ꯗꯤꯃꯥꯟ ꯇꯧꯕ ꯍꯧꯔꯛꯑꯦꯕ ꯑꯗꯨꯅ ꯑꯍꯣꯡꯕ ꯑꯃ ꯆꯥꯎꯅ ꯂꯥꯛꯑꯦꯕ ꯄꯦꯔꯥꯗꯥꯏꯝ ꯁꯤꯐꯀ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯨꯅꯤꯀꯣ ꯑꯩ ꯏꯪꯂꯤꯁꯇ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯒꯅꯀꯣ ꯑꯆꯧꯕ ꯑꯍꯣꯡꯕ ꯑꯃ ꯂꯥꯛꯇꯣꯔꯦ ꯁꯣꯁꯥꯏꯇꯤꯗ ꯕꯤꯀꯣꯁ ꯐꯦꯛꯇꯔꯁꯤ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯌꯥꯝꯃꯦ ꯚꯤꯂꯦꯖꯇꯒꯤ ꯁꯤꯇꯤꯁꯇ ꯃꯌꯥꯝ ꯑꯃ ꯂꯥꯛꯄꯗꯒꯤꯗꯤ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏ ꯄ꯭ꯔꯖꯥ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯁꯤꯅ ꯀꯣ ꯃꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯍꯤꯡꯅꯕ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯇꯥꯔꯦ ꯑꯦꯁ ꯋꯦꯜ ꯑꯦꯁ ꯑꯣꯄꯣꯔꯆꯨꯅꯤꯇꯤ ꯍꯦꯟꯅ ꯐꯪꯅꯕ ꯈꯣꯠꯅꯕ ꯍꯥꯏꯅ ꯚꯤꯂꯦꯖꯇꯒꯤ ꯁꯤꯇꯤꯗ ꯂꯥꯛꯑꯕꯅꯤꯅ ꯃꯣꯏ ꯑꯔꯕꯅꯥꯏꯖꯦꯁꯟ ꯐꯖꯅ ꯇꯧꯔꯦ ꯑꯗꯨꯗꯩꯗꯤ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯄꯨꯟꯁꯤꯁꯦ ꯃꯦꯀꯥꯅꯤꯀꯦꯜ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯛꯑꯦ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯌꯨꯅꯤꯛ ꯑꯣꯏꯕ ꯑꯥꯏꯗꯦꯟꯇꯤꯇꯤ ꯃꯥꯡꯅꯔꯛꯄ ꯅꯠꯇ꯭ꯔꯥ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯅꯤꯖꯝꯒꯤ ꯃꯊꯛꯇ ꯇꯤ ꯑꯦꯁ ꯑꯦꯂꯤꯌꯠꯀꯤ ꯁꯩꯔꯦꯡꯗ ꯀꯩꯗꯒ ꯑꯗꯨꯝ ꯊꯦꯡꯅꯔꯝꯒꯅꯤꯀꯣ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯄ꯭ꯔꯤꯂꯨꯠꯁ ꯀꯥꯏꯅꯒ ꯃꯥꯒꯤ ꯁꯩꯔꯦꯡ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯣꯀꯣ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯑꯦꯕ꯭ꯔꯤꯗꯦ ꯑꯗꯨꯝ ꯍꯧꯒꯠꯂꯛꯑꯅꯤ ꯀꯣꯐꯤ ꯈꯔ ꯊꯛꯑꯅꯤ ꯑꯣꯐꯤꯁ ꯀꯥꯔꯅꯤ ꯑꯣꯐꯤꯁ ꯍꯜꯂꯛꯑꯅꯤ ꯄꯣꯊꯥꯔꯅꯤ ꯁꯦꯝ ꯊꯤꯡ ꯀꯣ ꯏꯠ ꯋꯤꯜ ꯍꯦꯄꯟ ꯇꯨꯃꯣꯔꯣ ꯑꯦꯟ ꯑꯥꯐꯇꯔ ꯗ ꯅꯦꯛꯁ ꯗꯦ ꯃꯊꯪ ꯃꯊꯪ ꯁꯨꯝ ꯂꯥꯛꯄꯗꯀꯣ ꯑꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯃꯑꯣꯡꯗꯨꯅꯤ ꯑꯗꯨꯗꯩꯗꯤ ꯃꯤ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯁꯦ ꯂꯣꯟꯂꯤ ꯑꯣꯏꯕ ꯍꯧꯔꯛꯑꯦ ꯀꯣ ꯏꯟꯗꯁꯇ꯭ꯔꯤꯌꯦꯂꯥꯏꯖꯦꯁꯟꯅ ꯄꯨꯔꯛꯄꯗꯒꯤꯗꯤ ꯏꯟꯗꯤꯕꯤꯖꯨꯋꯦꯜꯁꯤꯡꯁꯦ ꯂꯣꯟꯂꯤ ꯑꯃꯁꯨꯡ ꯑꯦꯂꯤꯌꯦꯅꯦꯇꯦꯠ ꯑꯣꯏꯕ ꯍꯧꯔꯛꯄ ꯃꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯋꯦ ꯑꯃꯁꯨ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯅ ꯎꯕ ꯐꯪꯉꯦꯕ ꯑꯗꯨꯗꯒꯤꯗꯤ ꯚꯤꯛꯇꯣꯔꯤꯌꯟ ꯑꯣꯞꯇꯤꯃꯤꯖꯝꯁꯨ ꯀꯥꯏꯊꯔꯛꯄ ꯑꯃꯁꯤꯁꯨ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯅ ꯏꯔꯥꯏ ꯂꯥꯏꯅ ꯎꯕ ꯐꯪꯉꯤ ꯚꯤꯛꯇꯣꯔꯤꯌꯟ ꯑꯦꯖꯇ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯁꯤꯡꯁꯦ ꯂꯣꯏꯅꯃꯛ ꯄ꯭ꯔꯖꯥ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯁꯦ ꯏꯪꯂꯤꯁ ꯁꯣꯁꯥꯏꯇꯤꯒꯤ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯇꯥꯔꯦ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯑꯣꯞꯇꯤꯃꯤꯁꯇꯤꯛ ꯑꯣꯏꯕ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯄꯣꯖꯤꯇꯤቭ ꯑꯣꯏꯕꯒꯤ ꯃꯑꯣꯡ ꯑꯃ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯅ ꯎꯕ ꯉꯝꯃꯝꯃꯤ ꯑꯗꯨꯕꯨ ꯂꯣꯏꯔꯝꯗꯥꯏꯗꯗꯤ ꯚꯤꯛꯇꯣꯔꯤꯌꯟ ꯑꯣꯞꯇꯤꯃꯤꯖꯝꯗꯣ ꯀꯥꯏꯊꯔꯛꯑꯦ ꯇꯨꯊꯔꯛꯑꯦ ꯀꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ ꯍꯥꯟꯅ ꯄ꯭ꯔꯣꯃꯤꯁꯦꯁ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯗꯣ ꯂꯥꯜꯂꯝꯕ ꯀꯣ ꯃꯣꯏꯗ ꯂꯥꯏꯔꯤꯛ ꯍꯩꯔꯒꯗꯤ ꯇꯧꯔꯒꯗꯤ ꯅꯪꯒꯤ ꯑꯣꯄꯣꯔꯆꯨꯅꯤꯇꯤ ꯐꯪꯒꯅꯤ ꯈꯣꯠꯀꯅꯤ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯣ ꯔꯤꯌꯦꯂꯤꯇꯤꯗꯨꯅ ꯑꯃ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯝꯕ ꯀꯣ ꯕꯤꯂꯤꯐꯁꯤꯅ ꯑꯃ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯝꯕ ꯃꯗꯨ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯗꯣ ꯀꯣ ꯑꯗꯨꯗꯒꯤꯗꯤ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯅꯤꯖꯝ ꯂꯥꯛꯄꯩ ꯃꯇꯝꯗ ꯍꯧꯔꯛꯄ ꯃꯇꯝꯗꯁꯨ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏ ꯀꯔꯤꯒꯨꯝꯕ ꯐꯪꯒꯦ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯀꯥꯟꯗ ꯔꯤꯂꯤꯖꯟꯅ ꯍꯥꯟꯅ ꯄꯥꯏꯔꯝꯕ ꯑꯣꯊꯣꯔꯤꯇꯤ ꯀꯣ ꯔꯤꯂꯤꯖꯟꯅ ꯍꯥꯟꯅ ꯂꯩꯔꯝꯕ ꯃꯥꯒꯤ ꯁꯨꯄꯤꯔꯤꯌꯔ ꯄꯣꯖꯤꯁꯟꯁꯦ ꯁꯨꯝ ꯁꯨꯝ ꯄꯤꯛꯊꯔꯛꯄꯁꯨ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯅ ꯎꯕ ꯐꯪꯉꯤ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯅꯤꯁ ꯔꯥꯏꯇꯔꯁ ꯑꯦꯟ ꯑꯥꯔꯇꯤꯁ ꯔꯤꯌꯦꯛꯇꯦꯠ ꯑꯒꯦꯟꯁ ꯚꯤꯛꯇꯣꯔꯤꯌꯟ ꯃꯣꯔꯥꯂꯤꯇꯤ ꯀꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ ꯚꯤꯛꯇꯣꯔꯤꯌꯟ ꯁꯣꯁꯥꯏꯇꯤꯒꯤ ꯃꯥꯒꯤ ꯃꯣꯔꯥꯂꯤꯇꯤꯒꯤ ꯃꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯆꯠꯅꯕꯤ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯑꯒꯦꯟꯁꯇ ꯏꯔꯛꯄ ꯍꯧꯔꯦ social hierarchy ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯁꯣꯁꯥꯏꯇꯤꯗ ꯑꯋꯥꯡ ꯑꯅꯦꯝ ꯈꯥꯏꯗꯣꯛꯄ ꯀꯣ ꯃꯥꯅ ꯋꯥꯡꯕ ꯃꯥꯅ ꯅꯦꯝꯕ ꯀꯣ optimism victorian optimism ꯁꯤꯗ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯤꯁꯦ ꯑꯗꯩꯗꯤ ꯑꯃꯁꯨꯡ rigid conventions ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ ꯍꯣꯡꯗꯣꯛꯄ ꯌꯥꯗꯕ rigid ꯑꯣꯏꯕ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯒꯗꯤ in this context ꯀꯣ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏ ꯁꯣꯁꯥꯏꯇꯤꯗ ꯁꯨꯃꯥꯏꯅ ꯇꯧꯒꯗꯕꯅꯤ ꯁꯤ ꯇꯧꯒꯗꯕꯅꯤ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯒꯤ rules and regulations ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯗꯣ ꯑꯗꯨꯒꯤ against modernist writers ꯑꯃꯁꯨꯡ artistsꯤꯡꯅ ꯑꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯃꯥꯌꯣꯛꯇ ꯃꯣꯏꯒꯤ artistic thoughts artistic expressionꯗꯣ ꯎꯠꯄ ꯍꯧꯔꯦ expressing instead alienation doubt and complexity ꯑꯗꯨꯅ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ simple ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯝꯕꯗꯒꯤ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ complex ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯛꯄ doubt ꯂꯥꯛꯄ ꯍꯥꯟꯅꯗꯤ everything is decided everything is clear ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯒꯤ ꯃꯑꯣꯡꯗꯀꯣ ꯍꯧꯖꯤꯛꯇꯤ ꯑꯃꯨꯛ ꯑꯗꯨ ꯂꯩꯔꯛꯇ꯭ꯔꯦ alienation ꯂꯥꯛꯑꯦ doubt ꯂꯥꯛꯑꯦ ꯀꯣ isolationꯒꯤ feeling ꯑꯃ ꯐꯥꯎꯍꯜꯂꯦ complexity ꯐꯥꯎꯔꯦꯀꯣ ꯃꯗꯨꯅꯤꯀꯣ modernismꯒꯤ factors ꯑꯃ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯒꯗꯤ Modernism brought radical changes. Radical ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯒꯗꯤ ꯌꯥꯝ ꯑꯆꯧꯕ ꯑꯍꯣꯡꯕ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯅꯤꯀꯣ ꯃꯁꯤꯅ ꯈꯪꯗꯣꯏꯅꯦ in both form and content ꯐꯣꯝꯗꯁꯨ ꯀꯟꯇꯦꯟꯇꯁꯨ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯈꯦꯠꯅꯕ ꯑꯍꯣꯡꯕ ꯑꯃ ꯄꯨꯔꯛꯑꯦ ꯀꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ ꯏꯕꯒꯤ ꯃꯑꯣꯡꯗꯁꯨ ꯑꯗꯨꯒ ꯀꯔꯤꯒꯤ ꯃꯇꯥꯡꯗ ꯏꯕꯅꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯃꯇꯥꯡꯗꯁꯨ ꯀꯣ ꯌꯥꯝ ꯈꯦꯠꯅꯕ ꯑꯍꯣꯡꯕ ꯑꯃ ꯄꯨꯔꯛꯑꯦꯕ emphasizing innovation and experimentation ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ ꯑꯅꯧ ꯑꯅꯧꯕ ꯃꯑꯣꯡꯁꯤꯡ ꯑꯦꯛꯁꯄꯦꯔꯤꯃꯦꯟ ꯇꯧꯍꯟꯕ ꯀꯣ ꯏꯔꯛꯄꯒꯤ ꯃꯑꯣꯡꯁꯦ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯑꯦꯛꯁꯄꯦꯔꯤꯃꯦꯟꯇꯦꯜ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯛꯄ ꯍꯥꯟꯅ ꯂꯩꯔꯝꯕ ꯒ꯭ꯔꯥꯟ ꯇ꯭ꯔꯦꯗꯤꯁꯟ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯇꯥꯔꯦꯅꯦꯀꯣ ꯍꯥꯟꯅ ꯑꯐꯥꯎꯕ ꯔꯥꯏꯇꯔꯁꯤꯡꯒꯤ ꯁꯨꯃꯥꯏꯅ ꯏꯅꯕꯅꯤ ꯑꯗꯨꯅ ꯑꯩꯁꯨ ꯑꯗꯨꯃꯥꯏꯅ ꯏꯒꯦ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯒꯤ ꯋꯥꯈꯜꯂꯣꯟꯗꯣ ꯊꯥꯗꯣꯛꯑꯒ ꯏꯁꯥ ꯏꯁꯥꯒꯤ ꯁꯦꯜꯐ ꯑꯦꯛꯁꯄ꯭ꯔꯦꯁꯟꯒꯤ ꯆꯥꯡ ꯑꯃ ꯍꯦꯟꯒꯠꯂꯛꯄ ꯏꯅꯣꯚꯦꯁꯟ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯒꯅ ꯀ꯭ꯔꯤꯌꯦꯇꯤꯕꯤꯇꯤꯒꯨꯝꯕ ꯀꯩꯒꯨꯝꯕꯗ ꯂꯥꯛꯑꯦꯀꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ ꯍꯥꯟꯅ ꯏꯅꯔꯝꯗꯕ ꯃꯑꯣꯡꯗ ꯏꯔꯛꯄ ꯄꯔꯁꯄꯦꯛꯇꯤꯞ ꯑꯅꯧ ꯑꯅꯧꯕ ꯄꯨꯁꯜꯂꯛꯄ ꯃꯁꯤ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯁꯦ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯅ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯅꯤꯖꯝꯒꯤ ꯔꯥꯏꯇꯔꯁꯤꯡꯗ ꯏꯔꯥꯏ ꯂꯥꯏꯅ ꯎꯕ ꯐꯪꯉꯤ The period, roughly from 1900s to 1930, is generally called the modern period. Or 1900s tagi haiko, even though exact oina haiba natrakasu nisang line of haiba dainako. 1900s tagi na 1930s, Second World War houdringi the First World War gi manung pulapsiko. Akoigi modernism gi period law. While postmodernism emerged after World War II and gained prominence from the 1960s. Aduga postmodernism jinako. Modernism gi matunda lakani. Second World War matungda moigi popularity hingalei happy 1945 ki matungda hingalei aduga moigi prominence se 1960s ko and gain prominence from 1960s matungda neba ko yamna popular oiraktuise habidi miyamna accept tawtuise. However, such movements cannot be tied to precise dates. On the exact dates habidi like yamna lugani ko habidi modernism hari 1900s te hobani he 1930s te loibani he ko or ꯀꯩꯅꯣꯒꯤ ꯄꯣꯁ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯟꯅ ꯁꯦꯀꯦꯟ ꯋꯥꯔꯜ ꯋꯥꯔꯗꯒꯤ ꯍꯧꯔꯒ 1960sꯗꯒꯤ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯄꯣꯄꯨꯂꯔ ꯑꯣꯏꯕꯅꯤ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯁꯦ ꯑꯦꯛꯖꯦꯛꯠꯂꯤ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏ ꯉꯝꯃꯣꯏ ꯑꯣꯏꯊꯣꯛꯑꯣꯏ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ Modernism was not only an artistic movement but also a philosophical shift that transformed Western ways of thinking, living, and creating, offering new responses to our rapidly changing world. Modernism ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯁꯦ artistic movement ꯅꯠꯇꯦꯕ philosophical shift ꯑꯃ philosophical ꯑꯍꯣꯡꯕ ꯑꯃꯁꯨ ꯎꯏꯌꯦꯕ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯅꯀꯣ ꯑꯗꯨꯅ ꯋꯦꯁꯇꯔꯟ ꯋꯦꯁ ꯍꯥꯟꯅ ꯊꯥꯖꯅꯔꯝꯕ ꯈꯟꯕꯒꯤ ꯃꯑꯣꯡ ꯍꯤꯡꯕꯒꯤ ꯃꯑꯣꯡ ꯀꯣ ꯀ꯭ꯔꯤꯌꯦꯠ ꯇꯧꯕꯒꯤ ꯃꯑꯣꯡꯁꯤꯡꯁꯦ ꯂꯣꯏꯅꯃꯛ ꯑꯞꯔꯨꯠ ꯇꯧꯔꯒ ꯑꯅꯧꯕ ꯃꯑꯣꯡꯗꯣ ꯏꯔꯛꯇꯣꯏꯅꯦꯕꯀꯣ ꯑꯅꯧꯕ ꯔꯦꯁꯄꯣꯟꯁꯦꯁ ꯔꯦꯄꯤꯗꯂꯤ ꯆꯦꯟꯖꯤꯡ ꯋꯥꯔꯜ ꯌꯥꯝ ꯊꯨꯅ ꯍꯣꯡꯉꯛꯄ ꯃꯇꯝꯀꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ ꯏꯟꯗꯁꯇ꯭ꯔꯤꯌꯦꯂꯥꯏꯖꯦꯁꯟꯅꯕꯨ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯣ ꯑꯦꯗꯚꯥꯟꯁꯃꯦꯟ ꯏꯟ ꯁꯥꯏꯟꯁ ꯇꯦꯛꯅꯣꯂꯣꯖꯤꯅꯕꯨ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯣ ꯋꯥꯔꯜ ꯋꯥꯔ ꯑꯃꯗꯨꯅ ꯐꯥꯔꯁ ꯋꯥꯔꯜ ꯋꯥꯔꯗꯨꯅ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯣ ꯑꯗꯨꯅ ꯑꯍꯣꯡꯕ ꯃꯌꯥꯝ ꯑꯃ ꯄꯨꯔꯛꯄꯗꯣ ꯃꯗꯨꯒꯤꯗꯃꯛꯇ ꯃꯗꯨꯗ ꯔꯦꯁꯄꯣꯟ ꯇꯧꯅꯕ ꯍꯥꯏꯅ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯅꯤꯖꯝꯁꯦ ꯊꯣꯛꯂꯛꯈꯤꯕꯅꯦ ꯁꯤꯅ ꯍꯥꯏꯅꯤꯡꯉꯤꯁꯦ ꯑꯗꯨꯅꯤ The rise of modernism and postmodernism. Factors leading to modernism and postmodernism are significant. Factors mayam significant factors mayam like example rise of modern industrial societies and devastating impact of two world wars. modern industrial society ama tholakpa amasung world war ani duka first world war the second world war gi impact asubuduna ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯅꯤꯖꯝꯒ ꯄꯣꯁ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯅꯤꯖꯝꯒ ꯂꯥꯛꯄꯒꯤ ꯑꯆꯧꯕ ꯃꯔꯝ ꯑꯣꯏ although violence and cruelty have always existed seen even in ancient conflicts like Mahabharata war, scale and intensity of 20th century warfare were unprecedented. Wait to me, violence, haibaga, cruelty, haibaga, say, tum lairabani, have always existed. Mahabharata gi landagasu dum yaurabani, anopa nate habani, adubu, moigi degree, moigi charm, scale and intensity, haragati, haibati lan, haibase, First World War dagi lan hairiba concept se tholaki nate Second World War dagi nate ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯑꯦꯟꯁꯤꯌꯟ ꯀꯤꯡꯗꯝꯁꯤꯡꯗꯒꯤ ꯑꯗꯨꯝ ꯍꯧꯔꯛꯑꯕꯅꯤ ꯂꯥꯟꯒꯤ ꯋꯥꯈꯜꯂꯣꯟꯁꯦꯀꯣ ꯋꯥꯔ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯁꯦꯀꯣ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯕꯦꯇꯜ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯁꯦ ꯑꯗꯨꯗꯩꯗꯤ ꯀꯣꯟꯐ꯭ꯂꯤꯛꯀꯨꯝꯕ ꯀꯩꯒꯨꯝꯕꯁꯦ ꯑꯅꯧꯕ ꯑꯥꯏꯗꯤꯌꯥ ꯅꯠꯇꯦ ꯂꯝ ꯑꯃꯅ ꯂꯝ ꯑꯃꯗ ꯑꯦꯇꯦꯛ ꯇꯧꯕ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯁꯦ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯅꯦꯆꯔꯦꯜ ꯑꯣꯏꯕ ꯄꯣꯠ ꯑꯃꯅꯤꯀꯣ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯑꯦꯟꯁꯤꯌꯟ ꯍꯤꯁꯇ꯭ꯔꯤ ꯀꯩꯀꯥꯗꯁꯨ ꯑꯗꯨꯕꯨ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯐꯥꯔꯁꯠꯀ ꯁꯦꯀꯦꯟ ꯋꯥꯔꯜ ꯋꯥꯔꯒꯗ ꯊꯣꯛꯈꯤꯕ ꯂꯥꯟꯖꯥꯎꯗꯣ ꯑꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯗꯤꯒ꯭ꯔꯤ ꯑꯃꯁꯨꯡ ꯁ꯭ꯀꯦꯜ ꯅꯠꯇ꯭ꯔꯒ ꯏꯟꯇꯦꯟꯁꯤꯇꯤꯗꯨꯗꯤ ꯑꯗꯨꯛꯀꯤ ꯃꯇꯤꯛ ꯆꯥꯎꯕꯅꯤꯅ unprecedented ꯍꯥꯟꯅ ꯎꯔꯛꯇ꯭ꯔꯤꯕꯀꯣ ꯍꯥꯟꯅ ꯍꯥꯏꯗꯤ millions and millions of people ꯂꯥꯟ ꯑꯃꯗꯒ ꯁꯤꯕ ꯀꯥꯏꯕꯁꯦ ꯍꯥꯟꯅ ꯂꯩꯔꯝꯗꯦꯕꯀꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ a few hundred thousands ꯀꯨꯝꯕ ꯀꯩꯒꯨꯝꯕꯗꯤ ꯌꯥꯝ common ꯑꯣꯏꯕꯅꯤꯀꯣ but so many millions multiple millions ꯁꯤꯕꯁꯤꯗꯤ ꯍꯥꯟꯅ ꯍꯤꯁꯇ꯭ꯔꯤꯗꯁꯨ ꯂꯩꯔꯝꯗꯕꯅꯤꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯃꯇꯝꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯃꯤꯁꯤꯡꯅ ꯃꯗꯨꯗꯣ ꯑꯦꯛꯁꯄꯤꯔꯤꯌꯦꯟꯁ ꯇꯧꯕ ꯀꯥꯟꯗ ꯃꯣꯏꯗ ꯋꯥꯈꯟꯗ ꯑꯆꯧꯕ ꯑꯍꯣꯡꯕ ꯑꯃ ꯁꯤꯐ ꯑꯃ ꯂꯥꯛꯈꯤ ꯏꯁꯣꯔꯗ ꯊꯥꯖꯔꯝꯕ ꯀꯣ ꯒꯨꯗꯅꯦꯁ ꯑꯣꯐ ꯃꯦꯟꯗ ꯊꯥꯖꯔꯝꯕ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯗꯨꯁꯨ ꯂꯣꯏꯅꯃꯛ ꯀꯥꯏꯔꯛꯈꯤꯕꯀꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ ꯃꯤꯑꯣꯏꯕ ꯑꯃꯗ ꯑꯁꯨꯛ ꯊꯤꯅ ꯇꯧꯕ ꯉꯝꯕꯁꯤꯅꯗꯤ ꯀꯃꯥꯏꯅ ꯏꯁꯣꯔ ꯂꯩꯌꯦꯅ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯉꯝꯗꯣꯏꯅꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯒꯤ ꯋꯥꯈꯜꯂꯣꯟ ꯑꯃ ꯆꯦꯜꯍꯟꯈꯤꯕꯀꯣ ꯃꯗꯨꯅꯤ What was new was shock these events delivered to traditional belief that a just and benevolent God governed the world. ꯑꯗꯨꯅ ꯍꯥꯟꯅ ꯊꯥꯖꯅꯔꯝꯕ ꯋꯥꯈꯜꯂꯣꯟ ꯀꯣ ꯄ꯭ꯔꯤꯊꯤꯕꯤꯁꯦ ꯋꯥꯔꯜꯁꯦ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯋꯥꯔꯜꯁꯦ ꯏꯁꯣꯔ ꯑꯃꯅ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯕꯦꯅꯦꯚꯂꯦꯟ ꯑꯣꯏꯕ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ ꯀꯥꯏꯟ ꯑꯣꯏꯕ ꯖꯁ ꯑꯣꯏꯕ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯐꯦꯌꯔ ꯑꯣꯏꯕ ꯏꯁꯣꯔ ꯑꯃꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯁꯤꯕꯨ ꯌꯦꯡꯁꯤꯟꯕꯤ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯁꯤꯕꯨ ꯁꯦꯟꯅꯕꯤ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯒꯤ ꯋꯥꯈꯜꯗꯣ ꯂꯥꯜꯂꯝꯃꯦꯕ ꯒ꯭ꯌꯥꯟ ꯇꯥꯔꯦꯀꯣ ꯑꯗꯨ ꯆꯤꯡꯅꯔꯛꯄ ꯇꯥꯕꯅꯦ ꯅꯠꯇ꯭ꯔꯥ ꯏꯁꯣꯔ ꯂꯩꯔꯒꯕꯨ ꯑꯁꯨꯛ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯋꯥꯍꯜꯂꯤꯕ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ ꯐꯥꯔꯁ ꯋꯥꯔꯜ ꯋꯥꯔ ꯁꯦꯀꯦꯟ ꯋꯥꯔꯜ ꯋꯥꯔꯗꯀꯣ ꯄ꯭ꯔꯖꯥ ꯃꯌꯥꯝ ꯑꯁꯨꯛ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯏꯅꯁꯦꯟ ꯄꯤꯄꯜ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯁꯦ ꯑꯁꯨꯛ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯑꯣꯠ ꯅꯩꯔꯤꯁꯦ ꯏꯁꯣꯔ ꯂꯩꯕꯒꯤ ꯈꯨꯗꯝ ꯂꯥꯟꯅꯦ ꯀꯥꯏꯅ ꯃꯤ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯁꯤꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯃꯇꯝꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯔꯥꯏꯇꯔꯁꯤꯡꯕꯨ ꯑꯣꯏꯔో ꯊꯤꯡꯀꯔꯁꯤꯡꯕꯨ ꯑꯣꯏꯔോ ꯃꯣꯏꯅ ꯋꯥꯈꯜ ꯈꯟꯕ ꯍꯧꯔꯛꯑꯦꯕ ꯀꯃꯟ ꯄꯤꯄꯜꯅꯁꯨꯅꯤꯀꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ ꯀꯃꯥꯏꯅꯅꯣ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏ ꯁꯤꯗ ꯋꯥꯔꯤꯕ ꯈꯣꯠꯂꯤꯕ ꯏꯅꯁꯦꯟ ꯄꯤꯄꯜ ꯃꯌꯥꯝ ꯁꯤꯔꯒ ꯏꯁꯣꯔ ꯑꯃ ꯂꯩ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯁꯦ ꯀꯃꯥꯏꯅ ꯊꯥꯖꯧ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯤꯅꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯒꯤ ꯀꯣꯏꯁꯟ ꯑꯃ ꯍꯪꯕ ꯍꯧꯔꯛꯑꯦꯕ The suffering and brutality of the age shifted human attitude from faith to doubt or non-belief. ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ agnostic ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯛꯄꯀꯣ ꯍꯥꯟꯅꯗꯤ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯊꯥꯖꯅꯔꯝꯕ ꯏꯁꯣꯔꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤꯗꯃꯛꯇ ꯏꯁꯣꯔꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯕꯨ ꯀꯟꯕꯤꯗꯣꯏꯅꯤ ꯏꯁꯣꯔꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤꯗꯃꯛꯇ ꯂꯩꯔꯤ ꯈꯣꯠꯂꯤꯀꯣ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯕꯨ ꯄ꯭ꯔꯣꯇꯦꯛ ꯇꯧꯕꯤꯅꯤ ꯈꯣꯠꯄꯤꯅꯤꯅ ꯊꯥꯖꯔꯨꯕꯗꯣ ꯑꯁꯦꯡꯕ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯝꯗꯕ ꯃꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯋꯥꯈꯟꯗꯣ ꯀꯥꯏꯔꯛꯄ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯇꯥꯔꯦꯀꯣ ꯃꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯕꯤꯂꯤꯐꯇꯣ ꯀꯥꯏꯔꯛꯄꯅ ꯃꯔꯝ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯒ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯁꯦ ꯏꯁꯣꯔꯗ ꯊꯥꯖꯔꯝꯕ ꯏꯁꯣꯔꯗ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯁ꯭ꯄꯤꯔꯤꯆꯨꯋꯦꯜ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯝꯕ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯒꯦ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯔꯤꯂꯤꯖꯤꯌꯁ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯝꯕꯗꯣ ꯀꯣꯟꯅꯗꯤ ꯇꯞꯅ ꯇꯞꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏ ꯑꯦग्ꯅꯣꯁꯇꯤꯛ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯛꯄ ꯑꯦꯊꯤꯁ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯛꯄ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯇꯥꯔꯦꯀꯣ ꯏꯁꯣꯔ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯁꯤ ꯂꯩꯇꯦꯗ ꯏꯁꯣꯔ ꯂꯩꯔꯒꯗꯤ ꯁꯨꯃꯥꯏꯅ ꯋꯥꯔꯣꯏꯗ ꯀ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯒꯤ ꯋꯥꯈꯜꯂꯣꯟꯗꯣ ꯈꯜꯂꯛꯄꯅꯤꯅ ꯃꯤꯁꯤꯡꯁꯦ ꯏꯗꯨꯀꯦꯁꯟꯅꯕꯨ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯣ ꯑꯦꯛꯁꯄꯤꯔꯤꯌꯦꯟꯁꯦꯁꯅꯕꯨ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯣ ꯍꯥꯟꯅ ꯏꯁꯣꯔꯗ ꯊꯥꯖꯅꯔꯝꯕ ꯈꯣꯠꯂꯝꯕ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯗꯣ ꯍꯨꯟꯗꯣꯛꯑꯝꯃꯒ ꯑꯦग्ꯅꯣꯁꯇꯤꯛ ꯅꯠꯇ꯭ꯔꯒ ꯗꯥꯎꯠꯐꯨꯜ ꯑꯣꯏꯕ ꯑꯣꯏꯅ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯛꯑꯦ Immerse a belief in human responsibility ꯗ ꯐꯣꯀꯁ ꯇꯧꯔꯛꯑꯦ ꯄ꯭ꯔꯣꯒ꯭ꯔꯦꯁ ꯆꯥꯎꯈꯠꯄꯗ ꯑꯦꯟ ꯁꯦꯜꯐ ꯗꯤꯇꯔꯃꯤꯅꯦꯁꯟ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ ꯏꯁꯥꯅ ꯏꯁꯥꯒꯤ ꯗꯦꯁꯇꯤꯅꯤ ꯏꯁꯥꯅ ꯏꯁꯥꯒꯤ ꯐꯦꯠꯁꯦ ꯗꯤꯁꯥꯏꯠ ꯇꯧꯖꯕ ꯍꯥꯏꯅꯀꯣ ꯏꯁꯣꯔꯗ ꯁꯤꯟꯅꯗꯕ This outlook resonated with Nietzsche's late 19th century goal expressed in Thus Spoke Zarathustra for humanity to transcend dependence on God. ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ ꯃꯥꯅ ꯏꯕꯗꯀꯣ God is dead ꯀꯥꯏꯅ ꯏꯔꯝꯕꯅꯤꯀꯣ ꯃꯥꯒꯤ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯐꯦꯃꯁ ꯑꯣꯏꯕ ꯀꯣꯠꯀ ꯂꯩꯀꯣ and shape its own destiny through the ideal of the Superman. ꯑꯗꯨꯅ ꯁꯤꯗ Superman, Man and Superman ꯀ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯀꯣ ꯑꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯃꯑꯣꯡꯗꯅꯤꯀꯣ ꯑꯗꯨꯅ ꯏꯁꯥꯅ ꯏꯁꯥꯒꯤ ꯗꯦꯁꯇꯤꯅꯤ ꯁꯦꯞ ꯇꯧꯕ ꯏꯁꯣꯔꯗ ꯁꯤꯟꯅꯗꯕ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯇꯥꯔꯦꯀꯣ ꯏꯁꯣꯔꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯕꯨ ꯀꯩꯅꯣ ꯇꯧꯕꯤꯒꯅꯤ ꯈꯣꯠꯄꯤꯅꯤ ꯍꯥꯏꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯐꯦꯠꯇꯣ ꯑꯇꯣꯞꯄꯗ ꯊꯝꯕꯒꯤ ꯃꯍꯨꯠꯇ ꯏꯁꯥꯅ ꯏꯁꯥꯗ ꯐꯦꯠ ꯊꯝꯖꯔꯒ ꯏꯁꯥꯅ ꯏꯁꯥꯗ ꯕꯤꯂꯤꯐ ꯊꯝꯖꯔꯒ ꯐꯣꯀꯁ ꯇꯧꯔꯒ ꯏꯁꯥꯒꯤ ꯗꯦꯁꯇꯤꯅꯤ ꯁꯦꯞ ꯇꯧꯖꯕꯗꯣ ꯃꯗꯨꯗꯣ ꯅꯤꯠꯆꯥ ꯑꯣꯏꯅ ꯒꯣꯗ ꯏꯁ ꯗꯦꯠ ꯀꯥꯏꯅꯒ ꯂꯩꯕꯅꯤꯀꯣ ꯃꯥꯒꯤ ꯀꯣꯠ ꯑꯃ ꯑꯗꯨꯗ ꯐꯣꯀꯁ ꯇꯧꯕ ꯍꯧꯔꯛꯑꯦꯕ ꯃꯊꯪꯒꯤ ꯁ꯭ꯂꯥꯏꯗꯇ ꯉꯥꯛꯁꯤꯀꯣ characteristics of modernism modernismꯒꯤ ꯃꯒꯨꯟꯁꯤꯡ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯇꯥꯔꯦ ꯃꯗꯨꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏ ꯌꯦꯡꯗꯣꯏꯁꯦ Modernism began as a radical, anti-traditional movement that rejected inherited forms of art, literature, philosophy, and culture as inadequate for a rapidly industrialized, competitive modern world. Oh, modernism is a radical way. ꯍꯥꯟꯅ ꯂꯩꯔꯝꯕ ꯇ꯭ꯔꯦꯗꯤꯁꯟꯒꯨꯝꯕꯗꯒꯤ ꯅꯥꯊꯩꯔꯒ ꯂꯥꯛꯄ ꯀꯣ ꯍꯥꯟꯅ inherited forms of art literature philosophy ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯒꯗꯤ ꯍꯥꯟꯅ well established ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯦ ꯁꯤꯅ ꯆꯨꯝꯃꯤ ꯁꯤꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯔꯨꯜꯅꯤ ꯀꯟꯗꯤꯁꯟꯅꯤ ꯍꯥꯏꯅ ꯂꯩꯔꯝꯕ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯗꯨꯕꯨ ꯔꯤꯖꯦꯛ ꯇꯧꯔꯛꯄ ꯐꯤꯂꯣꯁꯣꯐꯤ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯣ ꯀꯜꯆꯔ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯣ ꯔꯤꯖꯦꯛ ꯇꯧꯔꯛꯑꯒ ꯃꯄꯨꯡ ꯐꯥꯗꯦ inadequate ꯑꯣꯏ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯒꯤ ꯃꯑꯣꯡꯗꯀꯣ ꯕꯤꯀꯣꯁ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯄ꯭ꯔꯤꯊꯤꯕꯤꯗ ꯑꯍꯣꯡꯕ ꯑꯗꯨꯛꯀꯤ ꯃꯇꯤꯛ ꯃꯌꯥꯝ ꯑꯃ ꯂꯥꯛꯑꯦ ꯑꯗꯨꯅ ꯍꯥꯟꯅ ꯂꯩꯔꯝꯃꯤꯕ ꯆꯠꯅꯕꯤ ꯔꯨꯜꯁ ꯀꯟꯗꯤꯁꯟꯁ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯁꯦ ꯐꯣꯂꯣ ꯇꯧꯔꯒ ꯂꯩꯕꯗꯣ ꯆꯥꯟꯅꯔꯣꯏ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯒꯤ ꯋꯥꯈꯜꯂꯣꯟꯗ ꯍꯥꯟꯅ ꯂꯩꯔꯝꯕ ꯃꯌꯥꯝ ꯀꯟꯗꯤꯁꯟ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯗꯨꯕꯨ ꯔꯤꯖꯦꯛ ꯇꯧꯔꯛꯄꯁꯤꯕꯨ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯅꯤꯖꯝꯒꯤ ꯐꯦꯛꯇꯔ ꯑꯃꯅꯦꯕ ꯑꯣꯔ ꯐꯤꯆꯔ ꯑꯃꯅꯦꯕ It marked a sharp clash between old and new ꯍꯥꯟꯅ ꯂꯤꯔꯕꯒ ꯑꯅꯧꯕꯒꯤ ꯃꯔꯛꯇ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯑꯆꯧꯕ ꯗꯤꯐ꯭ꯔꯦꯟꯁ ꯑꯃ ꯎꯕ ꯉꯝꯃꯤ captured in Ezra Pound's call to make it new ꯍꯥꯏ ꯅꯧꯍꯜꯂꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯒꯤꯀꯣ ꯑꯅꯧꯕ ꯑꯣꯏꯍꯜꯂꯣ ꯏꯔꯛꯄꯗ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯣ ꯑꯦꯛꯁꯄ꯭ꯔꯦꯁꯟꯗ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯣ ꯊꯤꯝꯗ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯣ ꯔꯥꯏꯇꯤꯡ ꯁ꯭ꯇꯥꯏꯜꯗꯕꯨ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯣ ꯖꯥꯟꯔꯥꯗ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯣ ꯑꯦꯅꯤꯊꯤꯡ ꯀꯣ ꯅꯧꯅ ꯏꯔꯣ ꯑꯅꯧꯕ ꯑꯣꯏꯍꯜꯂꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯨꯅꯦꯕ make it new ꯍꯥꯏꯁꯦ which urged artists to re-examine and discard established aesthetic, cultural, and religious conventions. ꯑꯗꯨꯅ ꯍꯥꯟꯅꯗꯒꯤ ꯂꯩꯔꯝꯃꯕ established ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯕ aestheticꯀꯤ ꯃꯇꯥꯡꯗꯕꯨ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯣ ꯁꯤ ꯐꯖꯩ ꯁꯤꯅ acceptable ꯑꯣꯏ ꯁꯤꯅ acceptable ꯑꯣꯏꯗꯦ ꯀꯥꯏꯅ rules ꯃꯌꯥꯝ ꯂꯩꯔꯝꯕꯗꯣ ꯑꯗꯨ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯗꯣ reject ꯇꯧꯕ ꯑꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯍꯥꯟꯅ ꯂꯩꯔꯝꯕ cultural ꯑꯃꯁꯨꯡ religious conventions ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯁꯤꯕꯨ reject ꯇꯧꯔꯒ or follow ꯇꯧꯗꯕꯤꯗ ꯑꯅꯧꯕ ꯃꯌꯥꯝ ꯑꯃ follow ꯇꯧꯔꯒ ꯑꯅꯧꯕ ꯃꯑꯣꯡꯗꯣ follow ꯇꯧꯕꯗꯨꯅ Ezra Poundꯒꯤ make it new ꯁꯤꯅꯦꯕ ꯃꯔꯝꯁꯦ Across the arts, modernism dismantled realism and fixed forms and fixed to realism to dismantle to painting abandoned representation through movements such as cubism and surrealism. Cubism and surrealism guys we modern we Picasso na yamado ko Pablo Picasso mo imana sinarbo forms we cubism and follow to the surrealism to the kana IBI have a very good example here Salvador Dali by ko Music rejected melody and harmony in favor of atonality and indeterminacy. Habadi hana yamna harmonious or melodious or track music suka atonal or indeterminate or Architecture replaced ornament with geometric forms, functionalism, and new materials like steel and reinforced concrete. Na architecture ki matangdana hana leramba yamna ornamental or yamna aesthetically pleasing or helamba ko fazahalam kolam madudi muhutta functional or helamba geometric ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯛꯄꯀꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ geometrical patterns ꯁꯤꯖꯤꯟꯅꯔꯒ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯕꯤꯜꯗꯤꯡꯒꯨꯝꯕ ꯀꯩꯒꯨꯝꯕ ꯁꯦꯝꯕ ꯁꯥꯕ ꯀꯥꯟꯗ ꯑꯣꯔ ꯌꯦꯛꯄ ꯀꯥꯟꯗ ꯗꯤꯖꯥꯏꯟ ꯇꯧꯕ ꯀꯥꯟꯗꯀꯣ ꯍꯥꯟꯅꯗꯤ ꯃꯇꯝ ꯑꯃꯗ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯅꯤꯖꯝꯒꯤ ꯃꯃꯥꯡꯗꯗꯤ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯐꯖꯕ ꯁ꯭ꯇꯥꯏꯜ ꯃꯈꯜ ꯃꯈꯜ ꯀꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯗꯤ ꯀꯦꯍꯟꯅꯕ ꯑꯥꯎꯠꯁꯥꯏꯠ ꯐꯁꯥꯗ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯇꯥꯔꯦꯀꯣ ꯐꯖꯍꯟꯅꯕ ꯇꯧꯔꯝꯕꯗꯣ ꯃꯣꯗꯔꯅꯤꯖꯝꯗꯗꯤ ꯐꯪꯁꯅꯦꯜꯗ ꯑꯣꯏꯅ ꯐꯣꯀꯁ ꯇꯧꯔꯛꯑꯦꯕ ꯃꯗꯨꯅꯤꯀꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯤꯁꯦ ꯃꯊꯪꯗ ꯂꯥꯛꯁꯤ Literature move away from chronological plots. Chronological plots are time the depend on habiti mathang lakdo ko chong the bit habitare ko habiti A B C D E F kind lakdo je chronological habi ko mathang lakdo. Close ending habiti resolution of fasna pibiram bato. Masi je koi gi li ra wari gumba kai gumba yam thengnai ko novel gumba drama gumba dai Shakespeare gi drama dai Victorian novels kuma kai gumba close ending adum thengnai ko and objective narration toward symbolism adugo objective narration am jo koina modernism lacking the khunu bungame objective oiba ko habidi narration je one side ki no oiba ko je subjective oiba perspective makan makan dagi narration do kani yengba phangamde yengba ngamamde ko adi muhutta kari do jalake habu kanda symbolism la symbolic oiba fragmentation machui taba tongan taba ko yan systematic oidaba tongan taba experimentation ubungame koina habidi irakpagi mong irakpagi style ko uti irakpagi theme gumba je makan ko and open ended structure aduga wari je koina sagi habit close endings gumba na taba open ended oiba ambiguous oiba wari je koina paba kanda reader amaga reader to pamga same topic to or same wari to paba kanda different conclusions ka lan ba gamba sugum yam to koina Modernism reshaped cultural and artistic expression at every level. On the cultural and artistic expression kasi level kudimakta modernism is shaped tori. Despite rebellious stance, modernism marked by nostalgia and despair over loss of earlier certainties. Yes, rebellious oiko hana leramba form makai against lay chumi adubu modernism da kuna nostalgia amasung despair hai how problem matabam gi kuna forward feeling ko strong feelings to kuna ubanga me hana certain oramba earlier certainties me oramba to adugi against kuna nostalgia wopangi writing sing da ko despair wopangi have nungai taba hana leramba structure hana leramba cohesion ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯁꯨ ꯂꯩꯇ꯭ꯔꯦ ꯂꯣꯏꯈ꯭ꯔꯦ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯒꯤ ꯋꯥꯈꯜꯂꯣꯟꯗꯨꯀꯣ ꯃꯗꯨꯗ This tension is expressed in T.S. Eliot's The Westland. Westland hariba poem ko T.S. Eliot ki masida yawi 1922 da published tobuse, which reflects spiritual and emotional desolation following World War One. On World War One matungda Eliot oiguma modern writer na moina phawgiba haibadi yamna hawai nungaitaba thamoi shokpa haiba tare ko haibadi First World War da myam akoigi human amada kari kari tobu ngami natra hotpa naiba fuba hatpa ngamba myam duna akoigi hana moi khanjaramba ki world view do kahelak haiba tare ko maduna TSC le uni thorakpada deep sense of sadness kamba ko apin. The poem portrays a humanity that has lost faith in God. Ishoda Thazarambato, Madu Thazabato Mangapa, meaning Hana Leramba, meaning God, meaningful or attract from Chijaka, Ibidi Lan has a meaningless war, with millions and millions of people, Miam, Halapadina. There is no such thing as meaning, have Wakadam Lam, and moral direction, on the direction the government Sakato no have to come on a morality key roles among Jalapa, Mijiloidam cruel winner. Surviving only amid cultural fragments from a shattered past. Fragmentation adu sidani ko. Cultural fragments me amma ure aduka past is punkai kai ko. Chikai happy mon. Its closing invocation of Santi, Lotion of the Opnico Santi, every word suggests a yearning for peace rather than its achievement on the peace pang banate Santi had his peace pang na yearning have the desire have ko. A deep desire have money ko. Aduna to the neighbor wiki the Westland Haripati Silit in 1922 gi Pomjita Santi ne invocation and Toriza. Peace Pangi Habinate, peace Pangnabaki prayer good and low. Modernist literature reached its height between roughly 1910 and 1930. Maybe 1900s like the Horagos got quite the strong over periods in 1910, 1930s. So that we can have the James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, the Gertrude Stein, IBA, Marshall Bruce ki yamna iconic oiba magi novel ko In Search of Lost Time kind of gamle fazaba myam yet hari lai ko ki poet ko magi Byzantium selling to Byzantium kind of e-boom to ni already he prays for clothes of heaven kind of label ko magi Virginia Woolf kina to the lighthouse later example kra haira ka ko already Mrs. Dalloway later ko adumyam already Gertrude Stein gini ko a rose is a rose is a rose adu Gertrude Stein gi dum hali ko already Kafka gi Franz Kafka gi the metamorphosis later the trial ko already the castle adumyam to ko heavy lo na mo lo na ta symbolism myam yawi mo gi works in the ko fragmentation yam yawi clear meaning yaude a sense of confusion am pawi every example in harabada Kafka gi the castle the in the papakanda bureaucrat sinki scathing criticism of bureaucracy kind of on a reader high talent reader of the character to the story the confusion modernism feature never eventually giving way to postmodernism. Key figures of the movement of modernism include W.B. Yeats, Virginia Woolf, Gertrude Stein, Marshall Bruce, and Franz Kafka. Their works are characterized by subjectivity, objective truth, subjectivity, rejection of objective narration, multiple narrators, blurred genres, quickie, clear, well defined genre, focus to mix of fragmented structures, and reflexivity. Texts that question their own nature and meaning. Text na text kind of question to sabza. Sibukan reflexivity ko iko. Modernism declined in 1930s and postmodernism emerged more clearly from 1960s. On modernism in 1930s ꯑꯗꯥꯏꯗ ꯃꯨꯠꯊꯔꯛꯑꯦ ꯀꯣ ꯑꯗꯨꯒ postmodernismꯅ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ clear ꯑꯣꯏꯅ 1960s ꯑꯗꯥꯏꯗꯒꯤ ꯑꯃꯨꯛ ꯊꯣꯛꯂꯛꯄ ꯍꯧꯔꯦ. Both share fragmentation and rejection of omniscient narrator. Omniscient ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯒꯗꯤ all seeing, all knowing ꯗꯨꯅꯤꯀꯣ. Narrator reject ꯇꯧꯏ. Differ in outlook. Outlookꯇꯁꯨ ꯃꯣꯏ different ꯑꯣꯏꯌꯦꯕ. Modernism views fragmentation with regret and nostalgia for lost certainties. ꯑꯗꯨꯅ modernismꯅ fragmentation ꯀꯣ regret ꯑꯃꯁꯨꯡ nostalgiaꯒ ꯀꯣꯟꯅꯅ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯀꯩ ꯍꯥꯏꯇꯥꯔꯦ fragmentationꯁꯦ regret and nostalgia ꯍꯥꯟꯅ ꯂꯩꯔꯝꯕ certainties ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯗꯣ ꯑꯗꯣ ꯃꯥꯡꯈꯤꯕꯒꯤ ꯅꯨꯡꯉꯥꯏꯇꯕ ꯎꯠꯂꯤ ꯅꯨꯡꯉꯥꯏꯇꯕ ꯐꯥꯎꯏ ꯀꯣ we as seen in the Westland ꯉꯁꯥꯏꯒꯤ ꯀꯣ T.S. Eliotꯀꯤ novel sorry poemꯗ ꯌꯥꯎꯕꯗꯣ whereas postmodernism celebrates it as liberating ꯑꯣꯅ ꯁꯤꯗ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ fragmentationꯁꯦ modernismꯅ fragmentation ꯂꯩꯔꯦ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯒꯤ ꯅꯨꯡꯉꯥꯏꯇꯕ ꯐꯥꯎꯕ postmodernismꯅ fragmentation ꯂꯩꯔꯦ ꯑꯗꯨꯅ liberation ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ freedom ꯐꯪꯉꯦ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯒꯤ ꯅꯨꯡꯉꯥꯏꯕ celebrate ꯇꯧꯋꯦꯕꯀꯣ ꯑꯗꯨ Modernism adopted austere, idealistic stance, rejecting 19th century ornamentation. And modernismna kari adopt toina haiba kanda austere oiba yantare yamna pure oiba haiba tare idealistic oiba stance haiba midiyeng ama lawi kari reject towi 19th century ornamentation. 19th century de yakpagi style yamna ornamental oiba yamna decorative oiba style do modernismna reject towi. This extended to architecture, where functionalism replaced decoration. Machine ko na architect, sai koi di literature matang na haibani. Amu architecture da ju koi gi yum sa ko the building sa ko kan ko design ma kai ko focus to we mota functionality to focus to ko hore. Though emotional depth remain, although emotional depth yaw the bra have them yaw. Postmodern literature pushed minimalism further. Minimalism got simple way by the basic way. Evident in reduced poetic forms in Yamhandari, and in Samuel Beckett's Spear Theatre. I would waiting for Godot, Harrigan, Spear Theatre, have another dark character, Anitami. No hope the Lubona Trump, Godot, Hariba, characters in Ira, Katumushing, waiting for Godot, Vladimir, Estragon, which explore absurdity, meaninglessness, the meaning came out, and existential futility. I would exist or Kenta Kaitare, meaning later, there is no meaning to existence. Postmodern criticism. Postmodern literature explores absurdity and existential meaninglessness, marked by a loss of faith in order. Order handler the mangpa, faith postmodernism factor money. Identity and meaning are no longer fixed but expressed through mixed genres, while language itself is treated skeptically, as in the Theatre of Samuel Beckett, where words expose their own emptiness. So the words moise yamna skeptically yamna in a very scrutinized manner di yengi ko aduga Samuel Beckett ki theatre daga ko words sing je yamna empty oiba and ko mogi rules am handan kolam je mina postmodernism gi matang phangeba. Unlike modernism's break with the past, postmodernism revisits it ironically. In Waiting for Godot, Godot symbolizes futile waiting for salvation. Salvation, futile, we cannot have any. When Godot ngai, Sungang on our Sungang Pangde Suna Laki throughout the play to Yagamagadi and Kanganganiko. And Lucky speech parodies religious certainty on the Magi speech in a religious certainty. Religious certainty is a hundred letter meuko. Yamno certain or me God like or have a certain or matuto postmodern matadana parody to parody haragati pagi that we have that to make fun of Hevenico. A similar idea appears in Three Sisters by Anton Chekhov. Anton Chekhov work Three Sisters where longing for Moscow represents an illusory ideal rather than the real change. And a single change illusory Moscow haragamon a real Moscow not to be done. This fake illusory version of Moscow in a focus of Anton Chekhov Three Sisters that we open. Postmodernism in art and literature. Late 20th century saw rise of postmodernism or metamodernism. Postmodernism, sorry, it's the layer, reacting against and extending earlier movements on the Moina reactions in Lobi, as well as postmodernism the Lobi. Postmodernism of 1980s rejected modernist austerity as elitist and embraced playful eclecticism, mixing styles and vocabularies from different periods. And the postmodernism to the vocabulary word ki choice kuma kai kuma ka style me amje different periods in the mix of Craig Rain pioneered Martian poetry. Martian poetry has a Craig Rain and Pazina Mana pioneer tokuni. In a Martian sense, a postcard home, Rain represents or presents everyday human life through an alien perspective. Anobani kuchina alien namgi perspective taki human kuise manoina present to making familiar appear strange. So nakuite am familiar but human as a kuini na ko. Akuite familiar with the Martian namgi perspective taki akuise strange to ne ko. Na chineba kugi postmodernism ki factor ma the poem uses defamiliarization to question perception and reality, describing ordinary objects through unfamiliar metaphors. So, ordinary objects unfamiliar with metaphors in describe them. This suggests that reality is shaped by language and culture, and the reality have a set language and culture going to shape the objective webinatis recalling allegory of the cave, plateau allegory of the cave, and aligning the poem with postmodern skepticism about fixed meanings and stable truths. Post moderns postmodernistꯁꯤꯡꯅ skeptic ꯑꯣꯏꯕꯀꯣ ꯃꯣꯏꯁꯦ ꯍꯥꯏꯗꯤ accept ꯇꯧꯗꯦ fixed meaning ꯂꯩ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯑꯃꯁꯨꯡ stable truth ꯂꯩ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯁꯦ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ postmodernistꯁꯤꯡꯅ accept ꯇꯧꯗꯕꯗꯣ ꯑꯗꯨꯗꯣ ꯁꯤꯗ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏ ꯐꯪꯉꯦꯕ. Postmodern theory further developed these ideas. In 1980s, Jürgen Habermas viewed modernism as a continuation of the Enlightenment project, grounded in vision and progress. Grounded in vision and progress. Vision and progress ko yaudutuni nako. Jürgen Habermas na hai. While criticizing thinkers such as Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida for undermining Enlightenment ideals, mana Jürgen Habermas na Michel Foucault hoi Jacques Derrida ho jemana mu criticize tawiko. Enlightenment ideals miyamdo handana thami handana yingi habi. In response, Jean-Francois Lyotard famously defined postmodernism as incredulity towards meta-narratives, arguing that grand universal explanation of history, truth, and progress no longer holds. So, now, grand narrative have universal explanation history have universal truth universal progress universal wait have Lyotard claim to. Instead, postmodernism favors plural. Maya mama have plural local mini narratives, have mini truths. Depending on the situation, effectively deconstructing Enlightenment certainties and reshaping how knowledge and meaning are understood. Enlightenment certain truth certain history is fixed Lyotard challenge mini narratives in the focus of grand narrative I was in a dystopia they have. Jean Baudrillard's book Simulations examines loss of the real has a manzala. He argues that images produced by film, television, and advertising blur boundary between reality and illusion, creating a culture of hyperreality. Manahai film the images the original film the ubi images television ubi images advertising na akhoi aseng baga illusion gi marakta leiramba boundaries sum blur to habiti clear welakte have define welakte have ne ba ona hyper reality habiti illusion no the focus of man whereas earlier science pointed to an underlying reality, modern science refers only to other science. Hanadi science in the reality refer to Rambato, modern times study modern science atopa science refer to reality the refer to them. Producing simulacra in which representation is replaced by simulation. A simulacra and simulation are my light of the Yawon. Baudrillard outlines 4 stages of this process. Stage Marie Lehego. First, science reflects basic reality. On the Ahmad, science reflects basic reality. An example in the crown amana king ama refer to with that call the religious symbol amana absolute truth to refer to the minor first level the sign basic reality reflector as in a realistic painting of an industrial city. Example in Piedmont. Anishubada, it distorts reality, as in a romanticized Victorian landscape. Romanticized Victorian landscape, reality not there. Romanticized by the and the Fazahan by real life the key Laporoponel. Third, it represents a representation exemplified by serious works such as Rene Magritte's paintings within paintings. Paintings within paintings, Rene Magritte, Kizet, Ubukanda. Painting ama yani the painting to the easel making vehicle, easel manum to the among landscape on the painting amagi manungda layer after layer yohanbutune. Finally, the sign bears no relation to reality at all, as in abstract art and abstract arts in the last stage name. So the truth to refer to tre have the reality is a magi importance so mangsali have the do you want postmodernism in art and literature is the painter Marcel Duchamp explained that this aim was to represent movement statically by showing multiple positions of a form without cinematic effects, reducing motion to simple visual indications. This reflects the idea that science can function in different ways to represent reality. Sigi artwork say if I remember correctly, when new descending the stairs have never. Oh na sing bagi new descending the stairs say when new over haragati erotic appeal ga yaw to pa ko adidi human gi figure human gi giveaways have tare ko human figure to give me am bu to ne ba madu ma'am do madu ma'am do ko si arbo si ude yan mechanical way ko yi thora ko jina ko oh na kare have tare ko ki han le ram traditional ideas of beauty. So by having karino, realism having karino, narrative having karino, have to reject or martial nako. Mana kaido focus to have a kind of movement and time the focus to CR works. Masida new descending a staircase number 2 Haragazu. Masida koi clear will be human body ma ubangamte Masia Bushita or the gidi Masigi paintings a yam abstract way, almost mechanical way. Aduga overlapping since myaung way. Aduna kuina artwork ama se fazagatobuni aesthetically pleasing ogatobuni kai ba kui han leramba grand narrative haibitare ko universal truth haibitare ko artwork city fazaba mean enjoy to hangatoba mi on the no hangatoba piece of artwork gadabni odai new oragana erotic ogatobuni kai habagi kui hana thazanaramba established truth myam je Marcel Duchamp na challenge to ko magi sida new descending the stairs to sida di human figure ma koi the clear in unte you nothing erotic about it ko sida to human figure unte rante ko adu ko beauty and sensuality celebrate to angular oheli artwork se ko machine like oheli matu me atu ko na machine ba kuina postmodernism ko art u ngami se hana leramba establish oraba kahtar beliefs puero tradition puero narrative puero technique puero or the desire puero me amdul unimak challenge to it machine ko example na Similarly, in literature, the boundary between the real and the simulated collapses. According to Jean Baudrillard, everything becomes an image or model, pure surface without depth, producing hyperreality. The solid real world dissolves into a network of images creating a crisis of literary theory. Critical approaches such as Marxism, feminism, and structuralism depend on a distinction between surface meaning and underlying reality, but postmodernism denies any deeper truth beyond appearance. And postmodernism is the deeper truth later, I'm going to claim to it. The third sign, where the image conceals the absence of reality, is central to postmodernism. Here, the image itself becomes reality, as seen in advertising. Advertising, where idealized images are unreal, yet accepted as real. Advertising, reality television, real, real and acceptable. Summing up. After a detailed study of this unit, you would have gained a comprehensive understanding of, clear understanding of the three constituent movements: modernism, postmodernism, and postmodernism. See a analysis sida modernism understand tore, postmodernism understand tore, amasung postmodernism understand tore. the differences between modernism and postmodernism, modernism ga postmodernism khenaba, and between postmodernism and postmodernism or metamodernism. Aduga modernism ga postmodernism kari khenai, postmodernism ga postmodernism kari khenai habado koi ngasi ki lecture ji matung ina understand to ngam. So that is all for today. Machine just introductory class ni ko koi modernism matang da next unit da koi amuk hena in depth details ko modernism je and analyze to gini और ngasi lecture ji gyan ta da ko to bi haura gadi mathangi lecture ta ko yamo analysis to na ba opportunity phangani ko. So that is all for today. I hope you all have a great evening ahead.